The story of Japan's transformation from a feudal society into a global power is often told as a narrative of remarkable modernization and rapid industrial progress. In textbooks, the Meiji Restoration of 1868 is presented as the moment Japan embraced science, technology, and Western institutions, propelling the nation from isolation into the modern age. Yet, when we examine the historical record more closely, the picture becomes more complex and sometimes contradictory. Alongside railways, factories, and educational reforms, Japan developed a powerful military, adopted aggressive foreign policies, and pursued imperial ambitions that would later culminate in regional conflicts. Why did a country so focused on modernization also pursue militarization so relentlessly? Was Japan's industrialization a purely internal effort to improve society, or was it inseparably linked to strategic and territorial expansion? In this video, we're going to examine this story in detail and uncover what history usually leaves out. The roots of Japan's rise lie in the collapse of the Tokugawa shogunate, a feudal system that had maintained peace but limited innovation and international engagement for over 2 centuries. By the mid-19th century, internal pressures such as peasant uprisings, economic stagnation, and samurai discontent coincided with external threats from Western powers. Commodore Matthew Perry's arrival in 1853 with his black ships and modern warships demonstrated Japan's vulnerability. The unequal treaties that followed exposed not only military weakness but also the technological gap between Japan and industrialized nations. This period created a sense of urgency among reform-minded leaders who understood that modernization was essential for survival. Yet the reforms they pursued were never purely civil or economic. They were intimately tied to strengthening Japan's capacity to defend itself and eventually project power abroad. The Meiji Restoration, officially beginning in 1868, marked the consolidation of imperial authority under Emperor Meiji. The new government embarked on an ambitious program of reform, combining Western models with Japanese traditions. Railroads connected cities, telegraph lines linked government offices, and modern educational systems were established to cultivate skilled engineers, bureaucrats, and military officers. Factories producing textiles, steel, and weaponry appeared rapidly, often with direct government support. While historians often celebrate these developments as a success story of industrialization, it is important to recognize that they were not neutral endeavors. Each reform carried strategic implications. Modern infrastructure and technology enhanced not only domestic productivity but also the state's ability to mobilize resources for defense and expansion. Industrialization and militarization were intertwined from the outset. Central to Japan's modernization was the development of a modern military. Inspired by Western powers, Japanese leaders studied European armies and navies extensively, often sending students abroad to observe foreign militaries firsthand. By the 1870s and 1880s, Japan had established a conscript army modeled on Prussia and a navy influenced by Britain. Military service was compulsory, and military education emphasized discipline, loyalty, and technical proficiency. The integration of modern industry and military capability created a powerful synergy. Domestic steel production, shipbuilding, and weapons manufacturing directly supported military readiness. Documents from the period indicate that leaders viewed industrialization and militarization as mutually reinforcing, with no clear separation between economic development and strategic preparation. The First Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 1895, offered a dramatic demonstration of Japan's newly acquired capabilities. Japan defeated China decisively, gaining control over Taiwan and securing recognition as a regional power. At the same time, Japanese military victories were accompanied by economic and technological exploitation. Railways and factories were expanded in conquered territories, and treaties often granted Japanese investors favorable terms. While modernization enabled these successes, the gains were inseparable from military aggression. The line between national development and expansionist ambition blurred, illustrating a pattern that would recur throughout Japan's rise in the early 20th century. Economic reforms also reinforced military capacity. The government encouraged zaibatsu, or large family-controlled industrial conglomerates, to develop heavy industries such as shipbuilding, steel, and chemicals. These corporations not only drove economic modernization, but also became critical suppliers for the military. The strategic logic was clear. A modern economy would support a modern army and navy. Education reform was similarly dual purpose. Schools and universities emphasized scientific knowledge, but curricula also instilled loyalty to the emperor and preparedness for military service. In this sense, Japan's modernization cannot be fully understood without acknowledging the strategic mindset that shaped it. Japan's foreign policy during this period further demonstrates the interplay between modernization and militarization. Expansionist ambitions were often justified in terms of national security and economic necessity. Korea, Taiwan, and parts of China became focal points for Japanese influence, with military intervention framed as protection of interests or civilizing missions. Historical documents, including diplomatic correspondence and internal policy memos, revealed that Japanese leaders were acutely aware of Western imperial models and sought to emulate them. Industrialization, therefore, was not merely a domestic project, it was a means of securing Japan's position in an international system dominated by industrial powers. Cultural and ideological factors also played a role. The Meiji leaders promoted nationalism, the idea of Japan as a unique and superior civilization capable of standing alongside Western powers. Shinto rituals, imperial imagery, and educational campaigns reinforced loyalty and a sense of collective purpose. Modernization was thus infused with an ideological narrative that justified militarization and expansion. The state framed technological and industrial progress not only as a way to catch up with the West, but also as a moral imperative to protect and advance the nation. Science and industry were intertwined with national identity and strategic ambition. Yet it is important to recognize the tensions within this process. Some reformers emphasized modernization for its own sake, advocating social, educational, and economic progress without immediate military objectives. Others saw rapid industrialization primarily as a tool to strengthen the state and prepare for expansion. The resulting policies were often compromises, producing both genuine societal development and aggressive military capability. For example, the education system raised literacy rates and scientific literacy while simultaneously producing a disciplined workforce ready for conscription. Railways improved commerce while also enabling rapid troop movement. Factories created goods and employment while supplying weapons for potential conflicts. This dual-purpose strategy became a hallmark of Japan's approach to modernization. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904–1905 further illustrates the link between modernization and militarization. Japan's victory over a major European power shocked the world and confirmed its status as a rising global force. Success was made possible by decades of systematic modernization, industrial infrastructure, military training, logistics, and technological adoption. Yet the victory also demonstrated the dangers of conflating industrial progress with military ambition. Japan's expansion into Manchuria and influence over Korea set the stage for future conflicts, showing that modernization carried strategic risks alongside benefits. The world began to see Japan as not only modern but also assertively militarized, capable of challenging established powers. This pattern continued into the 1910s and 1920s when Japan expanded its economic and strategic reach in East Asia. Industrial growth fueled the development of modern shipping, railways, and ports, all of which supported military mobilization. Political debates within Japan frequently reflected tensions between advocates of civilian modernization and proponents of militarized expansion. Documents from parliamentary sessions, internal reports, and military planning indicate that even economic decisions were evaluated for their strategic implications. Industrialization, foreign policy, and military planning were inseparable components of a single coherent national strategy. By the 1930s, Japan's dual trajectory of modernization and militarization accelerated dramatically. Economic pressures, including the need for raw materials, combined with nationalist ideology to justify aggressive expansion in China and beyond. Modern infrastructure, industry, and logistics enabled campaigns that would have been impossible just decades earlier. At the same time, the government emphasized scientific research, technological innovation, and educational attainment, reinforcing the link between knowledge, industry, and military power. By this point, it is clear that Japan's rise cannot be understood as a story of peaceful modernization alone. Its achievements were inseparable from strategic and militaristic considerations. In analyzing Japan's rise, we must confront a central paradox. Modernization provided the tools for economic development, technological progress, and social reform, yet the very same tools enabled military aggression and imperial expansion. Railways, factories, and schools served dual purposes, advancing national prosperity while strengthening military capacity. The pattern of intertwining modernization with militarization was deliberate, reflecting a strategic vision that sought both internal transformation and external security and influence. This duality would define Japan's trajectory into the mid-20th century, shaping not only its domestic evolution but also its role on the global stage. The 1930s marked a period when the dual nature of Japan's rise, modernization intertwined with militarization, became impossible to ignore. The global economic crisis of the Great Depression had significant consequences for Japan, exacerbating domestic pressures while intensifying strategic concerns abroad. Japan relied heavily on imports for essential resources such as oil, iron, and rubber, which made it vulnerable to international fluctuations. Government and military planners increasingly viewed expansion as a solution to both economic dependency and national security. Industrial modernization, while still advancing, was now being explicitly leveraged to support territorial ambitions. Factories that once produced consumer goods were reoriented toward military production, and technological innovations were deployed to improve weaponry, logistics, and communications for potential campaigns. This era raises an important question. To what extent did modernization in Japan serve the people, and to what extent was it a means to sustain military power? One of the clearest illustrations of this strategic modernization is Japan's occupation of Manchuria in 1931. The military rationale was explicit: secure raw materials and establish a buffer zone against perceived threats from the Soviet Union and Western powers. Industrial infrastructure in Manchuria, including railways, ports, and resource extraction facilities, was developed with a dual purpose: stimulating economic growth and ensuring military efficiency. Official explanations framed the occupation in terms of stabilizing the region and promoting economic development, but internal reports reveal a calculated focus on sustaining Japan's war machine. The speed and precision with which these projects were implemented reflected the efficiency born of decades of modernization, showing how industrial capacity and militarization had become inseparable in practice. The Japanese military increasingly dominated political decision-making during this period. Parliamentary structures existed and civilian bureaucrats continued to implement reforms, yet key policies, especially foreign and military strategy, were often dictated by generals and admirals. The ideology of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere emerged as both a justification and a vision for expansion. This rhetoric emphasized regional leadership and mutual prosperity, but it was underpinned by aggressive territorial ambitions. Industrial infrastructure supported these objectives. Steel mills, shipyards, and aircraft factories enabled sustained campaigns, while advanced communications and logistics networks ensured operational coordination across vast distances. Modernization was no longer an abstract goal, it was a tool of empire. At the same time, Japan's society experienced profound changes. Urbanization accelerated as industries concentrated labor in cities, while educational reforms produced a technically skilled population prepared for both civilian and military roles. Propaganda emphasized loyalty, discipline, and the nation's historical destiny, blending cultural identity with modernization and militarization. Students learned science and engineering alongside patriotic duties, and technical expertise became a form of national service. Internal documents and diaries from the period revealed that many Japanese citizens viewed technological progress as a marker of national strength, but this perception was inseparable from militaristic framing. Modernization and ideology were mutually reinforcing. Japan's foreign relations during this period further highlight the complexity of its rise. Tensions with China escalated into full-scale conflict by 1937, with modernized Japanese armies employing industrially produced weapons and coordinated logistics to achieve rapid territorial gains. Airplanes, mechanized units, and modern artillery, products of decades of technological advancement, played decisive roles. At the same time, the government sought to position itself diplomatically as a legitimate global power. Treaties, negotiations, and alliances were often pursued with the aim of securing resources and strategic advantage, rather than fostering genuine international cooperation. The interaction between technological modernization and foreign policy underscored the dual nature of Japan's rise. Every scientific and industrial achievement carried strategic implications. Economic strategy during this period also reflected militarized priorities. The state implemented industrial policies that prioritized sectors essential for warfare. Steel, chemicals, shipbuilding, and aircraft manufacturing received preferential treatment and investment. Zaibatsu conglomerates, which had been encouraged during the Meiji and Taisho periods, became closely integrated with military production. Firms like Mitsubishi, Sumitomo, and Kawasaki supplied ships, aircraft, and weapons, linking economic modernization directly to military capacity. At the same time, consumer industries were often subordinated to strategic needs, reflecting a deliberate allocation of resources towards strengthening Japan's warfighting potential. These choices illustrate the inseparable nature of modernization and militarization in practice. Despite the military emphasis, scientific and technological development continued to advance in ways that extended beyond immediate military needs. Research in chemistry, engineering, medicine, and aerodynamics progressed rapidly, and Japanese scientists contributed to global knowledge in these fields. Yet even these innovations were frequently applied to support strategic goals. Chemical engineering was used to improve munitions production, aeronautical research optimized combat aircraft, and medical advances supported soldier health and endurance. Modernization was thus a multi-layered process. It produced societal benefits and scientific knowledge while simultaneously enhancing Japan's capacity for conflict and expansion. Cultural narratives reinforced these dual objectives. Literature, newspapers, and educational materials emphasize the nation's destiny, portraying technological advancement as a moral imperative alongside military service. Celebrated industrial achievements were framed as evidence of national superiority, reinforcing the legitimacy of expansionist policies. At the same time, these narratives encouraged pride in modernization, fostering societal cohesion and support for policies that blended economic growth with militarized objectives. Japan's rise was not simply a story of industrial or technological progress. It was a narrative constructed to justify strategic ambition and cultivate national consensus. Japan's alliance-building efforts in the late 1930s further illuminate the interplay between modernization and militarization. Cooperation with Axis powers, particularly Germany and Italy, was motivated by shared strategic interests and the desire to consolidate influence in East Asia and the Pacific. Industrial and military advancements allowed Japan to participate meaningfully in these alliances, demonstrating capability and modern power. This period shows that modernization was not an isolated domestic phenomenon, but a crucial factor enabling Japan to assert influence on the global stage, often through military means. The state's approach combined economic, technological, and ideological elements into a cohesive strategy designed to secure both survival and dominance. By the end of the 1930s, it was clear that Japan's rapid modernization could not be separated from its militarized ambitions. Industrial infrastructure, scientific innovation, and social reforms were deeply intertwined with strategic calculations and expansionist goals. Modernization provided the tools necessary for Japan to wage war, project power, and negotiate from a position of strength, while militarization ensured that these tools served national strategic objectives. Civilian and military priorities were not merely parallel tracks, they were mutually reinforcing, forming the foundation of Japan's rise as a regional and eventually global power. The outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937 marked a turning point in Japan's trajectory, where modernization and militarization merged into a single coherent national strategy. The conflict revealed how industrial infrastructure, technological advancement, and logistical planning, products of decades of deliberate modernization, enabled Japan to wage sustained campaigns over vast territories. Modern railways, roads, and ports allowed rapid troop deployment, while factories produced weapons, ammunition, and vehicles necessary to maintain combat operations. At the same time, air power and mechanized units, both outcomes of scientific and industrial progress, provided Japan with a decisive advantage over less modernized adversaries. These campaigns illustrate the duality at the heart of Japan's rise. The same modernization that fostered economic development and technological achievement also facilitated militaristic expansion and occupation. Strategic planning documents from the period indicate that Japanese military leaders explicitly viewed industrialization as a critical component of national security. Factories, shipyards, and steel mills were not developed solely for domestic needs or economic profit. They were integral to Japan's capacity to sustain prolonged military engagements. Modernization and militarization were mutually reinforcing. The efficiency, scale, and technological sophistication of Japan's industrial base directly influenced the scope and effectiveness of its military operations. Moreover, the integration of education, technical expertise, and industrial production created a society capable of supporting these ambitious objectives. Schools and universities trained engineers, scientists, and technicians who would contribute both to civilian innovation and military capability, ensuring a steady flow of expertise into the strategic apparatus. The occupation of Chinese territories further illustrated how modernization enabled militarized governance. Japan built extensive infrastructure in occupied regions, including railways, communications networks, and industrial facilities, which served dual purposes, facilitating resource extraction and maintaining military control. The narrative presented to both domestic and international audiences often emphasized development, modernization, and civilizational uplift. Yet behind these claims lay a calculated strategy to consolidate control, maximize resource utilization, and sustain military operations. Economic and technological advancement was inseparable from the state's capacity to wage war, highlighting a recurring pattern in Japan's rise. Progress and power were intertwined. Internally, Japan's society became increasingly mobilized for the demands of war. Propaganda emphasized national unity, technological achievement, and loyalty to the emperor, blending pride in modernization with militaristic ideology. Civilians were encouraged to contribute to industrial production, conserve resources, and support military objectives. Education, media, and cultural institutions reinforced the notion that Japan's technological prowess justified expansionist policies and secured national survival. Modernization thus served both practical and symbolic purposes. It strengthened the state materially while cultivating ideological cohesion and public consent for militarized ambitions. Japan's industrial and military expansion also had profound geopolitical implications. By leveraging modern infrastructure and technological innovation, Japan challenged the established order in East Asia and beyond. Its naval and air capabilities allowed it to project power across the Pacific, positioning it as a regional hegemon capable of influencing global strategic calculations. At the same time, Japan sought alliances and diplomatic recognition from other powers, including Germany and Italy, to legitimize its ambitions. Industrial and military modernization and technological sophistication were central to these efforts, as they signaled capability, reliability, and strategic potential to both allies and adversaries. Economic policies of the late 1930s further reinforced this dual trajectory. The state exercised considerable control over industrial output, prioritizing sectors critical for military operations. Steel, shipbuilding, aviation, and chemical industries received substantial investment, while consumer industries were often deprioritized. The Zaibatsu conglomerates, integrated into national strategy, supplied both domestic markets and military requirements. Government incentives and coordination ensured that industrial modernization directly enhanced Japan's capacity for sustained military engagement, illustrating a deliberate convergence of economic development and strategic planning. Simultaneously, Japan invested in technological research that had both civilian and military applications. Advances in aeronautics, communications, chemical engineering, and metallurgy supported industrial growth and enhanced military efficiency. Military R&D often drove innovation that later found civilian applications, while civilian scientific advancements were adapted to meet strategic needs. This interdependence underscores a recurring theme. Japan's modernization was rarely neutral or purely domestic. It was shaped by strategic imperatives and oriented toward national survival and regional dominance. Cultural and ideological narratives reinforced this convergence. Nationalism, imperial ideology, and the concept of a unique Japanese destiny justified both modernization and militarization. The government and military framed technological achievement as a moral and cultural imperative, portraying industrial progress as evidence of Japan's capacity to lead, protect, and expand. Educational curricula, media, and public ceremonies consistently emphasize the integration of technical skill, loyalty, and service to the nation. Modernization became both a practical tool and a symbol of national identity, legitimizing policies that blended economic development with strategic ambition. Japan's alliance building and international positioning during this period further demonstrate how modernization enabled militarized influence. Cooperation with Germany and Italy, participation in global forums, and attempts to secure resources and markets were all facilitated by Japan's industrial and technological base. Modernization provided the infrastructure, expertise, and credibility necessary to assert influence on the global stage. Diplomatic maneuvers were closely tied to military readiness, showing that Japan's rise was a comprehensive strategy encompassing domestic development, international diplomacy, and strategic planning. The period also highlights the inherent tension between modernization for societal benefit and modernization for militaristic ends. Industrialization, education, and technological advancement undeniably improved standards of living, increased literacy, and expanded scientific knowledge. Yet these same achievements were directed toward preparing society and the state for war. The duality of progress and power raises critical questions about agency, intent, and consequence. To what extent were Japan's citizens beneficiaries of modernization, and to what extent were they participants in a system designed for strategic dominance? By the outbreak of World War II, Japan's transformation was complete, a technologically advanced, industrially modern, and militarily formidable nation. Its rise exemplified a dual strategy in which modernization and militarization were inseparably intertwined, each reinforcing the other. Railways, factories, and educational systems enabled economic growth while directly supporting military objectives. Scientific and technological innovation produced both civilian benefits and strategic advantages. Ideology and culture legitimized policies that pursued both modernization and militaristic expansion. Japan's trajectory demonstrates that industrial and technological progress cannot always be disentangled from strategic and military considerations, especially when survival and global standing are at stake. This complex interplay challenges simplistic narratives of Japan's rise. While often celebrated as a story of modernization, industrial achievement, and scientific progress, the reality is more nuanced. Japan's ascent combined genuine development with strategic militarization. Its industrial and technological prowess served national security objectives, enabled expansionist policies, and shaped global power dynamics. Understanding Japan's rise requires acknowledging this duality, recognizing that progress and ambition, science and strategy, modernization and militarization were inseparably linked from the mid-19th century through the mid-20th century. By the early 1940s, Japan's dual trajectory of modernization and militarization reached its zenith, culminating in the full-scale conflict across East Asia and the Pacific. Industrial infrastructure, scientific innovation, and logistical efficiency enabled rapid military campaigns, while the state's ideological apparatus ensured societal cohesion and support for expansionist policies. Cities and factories were mobilized, research institutions redirected, and transport networks leveraged for both economic and military purposes. Modernization, which had begun as a response to external threats in the mid-19th century, had become inseparable from Japan's militarized ambitions, allowing the nation to wage war on a scale that would have been unimaginable just decades earlier. Yet the very progress that empowered Japan also exposed the vulnerabilities inherent in overextension, raising questions about the limits and consequences of a development strategy intertwined with military expansion. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 illustrates the culmination of this trajectory. The strike was made possible not simply by military planning, but by decades of technological and industrial preparation. Aircraft carriers, long-range bombers, and naval vessels were products of Japan's modernization efforts, while coordinated communications and logistical support enabled a complex, high-stakes operation. At the same time, ideological narratives framed the attack as a defensive measure designed to secure resources and protect national survival. Behind the dramatic military action lay a systematic process in which scientific advancement, industrial capacity, and strategic planning had been fused to serve both immediate and long-term objectives. The Pearl Harbor operation was therefore a stark demonstration of how modernization and militarization were mutually reinforcing. The ensuing campaigns across Southeast Asia and the Pacific reveal further examples of this dual-use strategy. Japan's military relied on mechanized units, modern artillery, and communications networks to secure territory quickly and efficiently. Industrialized logistics allowed sustained occupation and supply over vast distances, while technological innovations in weaponry and navigation provided a competitive edge. Factories, ports, and railways constructed during earlier modernization efforts were rapidly adapted to support military objectives. Occupied territories were often integrated into Japan's broader strategic and industrial system, providing resources, labor, and infrastructure that sustained the war effort. Modernization was not an incidental factor in Japan's success; it was central to its ability to project power. Internally, the mobilization of society intensified. Civilians participated in industrial production, rationing, and educational programs designed to support the war. Technicians, engineers, and scientists were deployed to military-industrial projects, ensuring that technological progress directly contributed to operational capability. Propaganda reinforced national unity, emphasizing both pride in modern achievements and the moral imperative of defending and expanding the nation. Education and cultural programming trained citizens to see technical skill and industrial productivity as forms of patriotic duty, blurring the line between civilian development and militarized purpose. Japan's modernization, therefore, was experienced as both societal advancement and national service, reflecting the fusion of progress and strategy. Japan's alliances and interactions with other Axis powers further demonstrate the strategic dimensions of its modernization. Cooperation with Germany and Italy relied on technological and industrial capabilities that enabled Japan to participate meaningfully in joint operations and strategic planning. Military technology, logistics, and industrial output were leveraged to secure recognition and influence, highlighting the international ramifications of domestic modernization efforts. Japan's rise, while domestically driven, had clear global consequences. It reshaped regional power structures and challenged existing hierarchies, with industrial and technological capacity serving as the foundation of both military effectiveness and diplomatic leverage. However, the same industrial and technological strengths that enabled Japan's expansion also created vulnerabilities. Overextension, reliance on imported resources, and the concentration of industrial capacity in specific regions exposed the nation to strategic risk. Allied bombing campaigns targeted key industrial centers, demonstrating that the interdependence of modernization and militarization could be exploited. Scientific and technological advances, while facilitating military campaigns, could not fully mitigate these risks. Japan's trajectory thus illustrates a fundamental tension. The tools of progress can enable ambition, but they also amplify exposure to strategic pressures and external constraints. Throughout this period, it is essential to recognize the nuanced interplay of modernization and militarization. Japan's rise was neither solely a story of industrial achievement nor merely a narrative of aggressive expansion. It was a calculated integration of technological advancement, economic development, and strategic planning, reinforced by cultural and ideological narratives. Scientific progress supported military capability, industrial infrastructure enabled territorial ambition, and education cultivated both skilled professionals and loyal citizens. Modernization and militarization were inseparable, creating a system in which every element reinforced the other, producing both remarkable achievements and destructive consequences. The end of World War II would ultimately expose the limits of this dual approach. Japan's industrial and technological sophistication could not offset overwhelming military opposition and resource constraints. Cities and factories, once engines of both progress and power, were destroyed, demonstrating the fragility inherent in a strategy that fused modernization with militarization. At the same time, the legacy of scientific achievement, industrial skill, and educational infrastructure endured, influencing post-war reconstruction and Japan's subsequent emergence as a technological and economic powerhouse. This outcome underscores the paradox of Japan's rise. Modernization enabled militarized ambition, but the same foundations later facilitated recovery and peaceful development. Examining Japan's trajectory also raises enduring questions about the relationship between progress and power. Can technological and industrial modernization ever be fully separated from strategic or militaristic imperatives? To what extent do ideological and cultural narratives shape the way societies pursue development? Japan's experience illustrates that modernization is rarely a neutral or purely civil process. It is embedded in social, political, and strategic contexts that shape both its goals and consequences. The nation's rise offers a historical case study in the duality of progress. Achievement and ambition, innovation and strategy, societal advancement and militarized capability were inseparably linked. Ultimately, Japan's story from the Meiji Restoration to the Pacific War demonstrates a persistent duality in the rise of nations. Industrialization, scientific advancement, and social reform were never divorced from strategic concerns. The successes of modernization facilitated military power, while military ambition drove further technological and industrial development. Cultural and ideological frameworks legitimized both, creating a society in which progress and power reinforced each other. Understanding Japan's rise requires acknowledging this interdependence, recognizing that Japan's modernization cannot be understood without also considering its militarization and vice versa. By reflecting on this history, we confront the complexity of national transformation. Japan's achievements were real. Literacy, industry, infrastructure, and scientific advancement reshaped society. Yet these same achievements were harnessed to pursue strategic objectives, territorial expansion, and military dominance. The narrative of Japan's rise is therefore neither wholly celebratory nor wholly condemnatory. It is layered, multifaceted, and instructive. Modernization and militarization were entwined forces, producing both extraordinary achievements and destructive consequences. Understanding this interplay allows us to see Japan's rise not as a linear story of progress, but as a complex negotiation between ambition, capability, and circumstance, a lesson that continues to resonate in global history today. By the mid-1940s, Japan's trajectory of modernization intertwined with militarization reached a point of crisis. Decades of industrial expansion, scientific innovation, and strategic planning had produced a nation capable of projecting power across East Asia and the Pacific, but these very capabilities carried inherent risks. Overextension, dependence on imported resources, and concentrated industrial infrastructure left Japan vulnerable to both economic disruption and military retaliation. The relentless pursuit of modernization to support militaristic ambitions ultimately culminated in catastrophic consequences: widespread destruction of cities, civilian casualties, and the dismantling of the military-industrial complex after Japan's surrender in 1945. Yet even in defeat, the underlying structures of industrial, technological, and educational progress endured, providing a foundation for post-war reconstruction and Japan's subsequent emergence as a technological and economic powerhouse. This outcome underscores the paradox of Japan's rise. Modernization enabled militarized ambition, but the same foundations later facilitated recovery and peaceful development. Japan's post-war transformation further illustrates the enduring tension between modernization and its applications. Under Allied occupation, policies emphasized demilitarization, democratization, and economic development. Military structures were dismantled, yet industrial and technological capacity remained, now redirected toward civilian and commercial purposes. Education continued to cultivate technical and scientific expertise, and industrial conglomerates reoriented towards consumer goods, manufacturing, and global trade. The human and institutional capital built over decades of modernization enabled Japan to recover quickly and emerge as a technological and economic powerhouse by the late 20th century. This outcome underscores a crucial lesson: the tools of modernization can serve both destructive and constructive ends, depending on the political, social, and strategic context. Examining Japan's rise and fall also raises enduring questions about the relationship between progress and power. To what extent can industrial and technological modernization be disentangled from strategic or militaristic objectives? How do cultural narratives and ideological frameworks shape the way societies pursue development? Japan's history illustrates that modernization is rarely neutral. It is embedded in political, social, and strategic structures that determine its purpose and consequences. From the Meiji Restoration to the Pacific War, progress, ambition, and militarization were inseparable forces. Railways, factories, schools, and research institutes were tools of societal advancement, yet simultaneously instruments of national strategy and military expansion. Understanding this duality is essential to appreciating the complexities of Japan's rise. Cultural and ideological narratives played a central role in sustaining this dual path. Nationalist ideology, the concept of the emperor as a unifying symbol, and the framing of technological progress as a moral imperative reinforced both modernization and militarization. Education, media, and public ceremonies celebrated scientific and industrial achievements while embedding loyalty, discipline, and strategic purpose into societal norms. The result was a society in which civilian and military objectives were mutually reinforcing. Technical skill was patriotic duty, and economic productivity served both national prosperity and strategic readiness. This interconnection illustrates how modernization cannot be fully understood in isolation from the cultural and political context that shapes its goals. Japan's experience also highlights the complexity of evaluating historical progress. Industrialization, technological advancement, and educational reform produced significant societal benefits, including increased literacy, scientific knowledge, and infrastructure. Yet these same achievements were harnessed to support expansionist and militarized ambitions, with consequences that included international conflict, occupation, and human suffering. The duality of progress, its capacity to enable both constructive and destructive outcomes, complicates simplistic narratives of national development. Japan's rise demonstrates that achievements in modernization are inseparable from the strategic and ideological framework in which they occur. Ultimately, Japan's trajectory from the Meiji Restoration through World War II exemplifies the inseparable interplay between modernization and militarization. Industrial infrastructure, scientific innovation, and educational advancement were all leveraged to build military power and project influence. Yet these same foundations later enabled peaceful reconstruction and economic resurgence. The nation's rise and fall illustrate that progress, ambition, and strategy are rarely distinct. They are intertwined forces that shape both opportunity and vulnerability. Understanding Japan's history requires recognizing this complexity, acknowledging that modernization and militarization were mutually reinforcing, and appreciating the nuanced consequences of pursuing technological and industrial advancement within a strategic framework. The story of Japan's rise leaves us with critical questions that echo beyond the historical period itself. Could Japan's modernization have followed a purely civilian path, or was militarization an inevitable consequence of the geopolitical and cultural context? How do societies balance technological progress, economic development, and strategic objectives without producing destructive outcomes? Japan's experience suggests that these questions do not have simple answers. Modernization can be a vehicle for prosperity and innovation, but when coupled with militarized ambition, it carries both transformative potential and profound risk. The dual legacy of Japan's rise, the achievements it produced and the conflicts it provoked, remains a powerful lesson in the interplay of technology, strategy, and society. In reflecting on this history, it becomes clear that Japan's modernization cannot be celebrated solely as a story of progress, nor condemned only as a narrative of aggression. It was both, a carefully cultivated strategy that advanced society, technology, and industry while simultaneously supporting militarization and expansion. The accomplishments of Japanese engineers, scientists, and industrialists were real, yet they existed within a broader framework of national ambition and strategic calculation. Understanding this duality provides a richer, more nuanced perspective on Japan's rise, one that goes beyond simplistic interpretations and illuminates the complex forces that shape the destinies of nations. The rise of Japan, therefore, is a story of intertwined progress and power, achievement and strategy, modernization and militarization. By examining this history in detail, we can appreciate the remarkable ingenuity and vision of Japan's leaders and citizens, while also understanding the costs and consequences of harnessing progress for strategic objectives. This dual narrative reminds us that history is rarely linear or simple. It is a web of interconnected forces, choices, and consequences, where ambition and innovation coexist with risk and responsibility. Japan's transformation offers enduring lessons about the delicate balance between development, strategy, and the human capacity to shape both prosperity and conflict.